Die Sprachübertragung beginnt jetzt. Alle Teilnehmer befinden sich im Zuhörermodus.
Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar about the OEKO-TEX Portfolio Updates 2019. Let me just start with a few house rules. The webinar will be recorded, which is why you're all muted so that we have a good sound quality. And after the webinar, you will receive a link where you can download the webinar in case you want to listen to it again or share it with colleagues. You will also have the opportunity to ask questions. As you can see, there is a chat function available to you. So please type the questions you may have and send them to us. And we will try to answer them at the end of the presentation. And now allow me to introduce today's speaker, Ben Mead. Ben represents OEKO-TEX in the US. Prior to joining OEKO-TEX, Ben consulted with a variety of brands and industry associations, including Textile Exchange and a firm with the goal of increasing industry engagement in green chemistry and sustainable textile processing. Ben started his career working for Nike, where he helped develop a restricted substances program and was involved in sustainable materials and water programs. Ben has degrees in chemistry and textile chemistry from North Carolina State University. Today, Ben will review the 2019 updates to the OEKO-TEX guidelines for their testing, certification, and labeling programs. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you. Thanks for the kind introduction. I'm very happy today to have the chance again to present these changes and once again also to help keep the OEKO-TEX community prepared really for the ever-changing market expectations. So once again, we're really confident that with the changes that are introduced, that maybe many of you have seen with the press release that are introduced for 2019, you can continue to use the OEKO-TEX certifications to help deliver safe and more sustainable products to customers. So I'll just remind everyone, although if you've joined us today, you're probably already aware, the highlights of the updates are available on the OEKO-TEX website and are reflected in the standards documents with a version date of January 2019. And those again are also available for download on the website. So our primary focus today is on the changes for standard 100. So you'll see the bulk of what we're talking about really affects the standard 100, as that is the most commonly used certification from OEKO-TEX. But we'll also, where it's appropriate, highlight some of the connections to the changes for the same chemicals in some of the other OEKO-TEX standards as well. So thanks again for joining us. The changes that we're going to talk about today were really first announced January 2nd, and all of those will automatically go into effect with all the new certifications and the renewals that are starting April 1st. So again, you don't have to worry about taking any special actions to incorporate these new changes into your renewal process. And as always, any certificate renewal process can be started up to 3 months in advance of the expiration date to try and prevent any gap or lapse in certification that could affect your customers and your product labeling. So with that, let me see if we can move it forward. We got a little bit of a lag, so we'll try and make sure I don't get ahead of myself here. So we want to get started. We want to jump right into, I would say, what's the biggest news of the end of last year and what's affected a lot of the communication we're talking about today, and that's the new REACH regulation around CMR substances in textiles that was introduced in October. And we know many people are already aware of this because we've gotten several calls and emails wanting to make sure that OEKO-TEX was going to be updating the standards to include those changes. So it's always exciting for people to be anxious to get these updates and this information here that we always try to do in the early part of the year. So of course, within OEKO-TEX, regulatory compliance is an important use of the standard 100. So we're going to highlight how this new regulation affects not only standard 100, but also the leather standard, and then trickles down into ECO-Passport, as well as some changes within STEP. Okay. So the new requirements specifically for textiles is coming out of the modification to REACH Annex 17. And this modification is known as Entry 72 and covers 33 CMR substances. So CMR substances meaning carcinogenic, mutagenic, or toxic for reproduction hazards. So we'll look at what's intended to be covered in the next couple slides as well. So again, the regulation is of course relevant to textile clothing and accessories. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be talking about it today. There's some examples that are provided here that come directly from the regulation. We want to share that, but also note that it's not an exhaustive list, but really examples given by ECHA. And so when the regulation goes into effect November 1st, 2020, it will apply to clothing in general, unless there are some specific exemptions. And so here we have your most traditional clothing items that are of course required to meet the requirements. And then even some of the accessory type clothing and articles that we might not normally classify as clothing, but if they're made out of textiles, so including bags, handbags, straps for watches, those also would be covered by the requirements. So again, would be a great application place to start using standard 100 in there. And then finally, even textiles which are not clothing but do come into direct contact with the skin under these reasonably foreseeable uses are covered as well. So that really gets into the home textiles area, some embellishments, even shoes, as far as they're made out of textiles, but the leather itself is not covered by the regulation here as well. So there are a few exceptions here that we know will be in place. So PPE, as there are separate directives, medical products, again, separate regulations that need to be followed for those types of products. And then, as already mentioned, leather itself is not covered within this regulation, but you'll see that OEKO-TEX is already considering that in some places as well. One of the other things to note out of the regulation is that the proximity to the body is not considered according to classes in the regulation. So there's no difference whether it's going to be used directly against the skin or not. So that's a little bit of a difference in terms of the way that the OEKO-TEX standards are written. The restriction, the CMR restriction here out of REACH does not provide a classification for textiles or limit values according to the proximity. And so you'll see some of that reflected in changes in the product class limit values, where maybe we had the opportunity to have different classes within standard 100. Some of those are going to have to be adjusted, and it really means that the CMR regulation is going to apply to all textiles in the same way, regardless of how they're used. So before we start looking at some of the details of the individual substances where changes have occurred within the standards, I want to highlight that the substances included here on the list are already covered, and in many cases have been covered for many years by the standard 100, and as well as other OEKO-TEX products. So we're not going to spend time today really talking about those substances which were already covered and no changes were required in the standard 100 or other OEKO-TEX products. But we do just want to highlight that just because we're not talking about them, they are still covered if they're within the CMR directive here. And so that can already be taken care of, and you don't have to worry about those. So what we want to focus on is where we're implementing changes within the OEKO-TEX standards as a result of this. So in the OEKO-TEX standards, there are some amendments that are necessary even to cover some of the products or some of the substances which are included within the CMR regulation and were already mentioned in some way within the standard 100 and other standards as well. So for these four examples, just as an example there are several different cases where the substances were either partly included in the OEKO-TEX requirements or limit values needed to be adjusted, and modifications were necessary really to prepare the certificate holders and certificate users for the implementation in 2020. And so those are the areas that we're going to focus on right now. So getting right into the limits, this is, I know, where everybody's excited to talk about or listen to, at least. So As it's already mentioned, changes in this section are directly in order to demonstrate full compliance to the issued regulation ahead of the phase-in date. So as mentioned, the phase-in date is November 1st, 2020. These changes for OEKO-TEX are going to be coming into effect in April 1st, 2019 for us. So as ECHA makes the disclaimer at the bottom that the list is under constant observation and additions or limit value changes are possible at any time, OEKO-TEX also will continue to monitor that. And so if it's necessary outside of the normal annual updates that we're talking about like today, there also is always the potential for OEKO-TEX to issue an update bulletin and keep everybody well informed if there's a necessary change. Okay, test methods. So the test methods are not normally specified in these REACH restrictions, although there is some guidance given. And so even though this is behind the scenes and something that most certificate holders are not concerning themselves with, it's also something that OEKO-TEX does review in the process annually to compare already established methods and make changes accordingly, or in the cases where new substances were added, to make sure that the new test methods are going to be in accordance with the requirements of the regulation here. In this case, I'm not going to read the whole section. You'll have access to the slides and you'll have access to the recording after the presentations. But the requirements, again, we just want to emphasize that the requirements to meet the specified limit values go into effect November 1st, 2020. And so with these changes being implemented now for new certificates renewed after April 1st, 2019, OEKO-TEX is preparing you well in advance to be able to use Standard 100 as a tool for legislative compliance as usual. So we'll start with the specifics here. Formaldehyde, of course, this has been included in the Standard 100 for a long time. The planned target value of the CMR regulation is 75 parts per million, which is probably a familiar number to many people. In the discussions around where the CMR regulation should be coming up, OEKO-TEX was often discussed as a reference value. And of course, this is the limit value for product class 2 in the previous versions of the standard. So what we have in place here is a transition period for some of these products, for certain products up until 2023. So particularly for jackets, coats, upholstery, where there may be a lack of alternatives, or there's some other benefit, particularly around structural protection, flame retardancy, things like that. That's not a permanent exemption, but at least is giving a little bit more time to phase in where this limit value is coming lower than people have expected in the past, and changes to alternatives are necessary. So what we see based on the historical data, which we're illustrating a little bit here, is that we don't expect a big impact in this change as we move towards 75 parts per million for other product classes, based on the historical testing data. So even with the transition period, as mentioned, that's being allowed by ECHA, we're starting the transition from the OEKO-TEX side now. So we've implemented a reduction for product class 3, really to help support this transition. So you see in product class 3, the limit value in this case is changing from 300 parts per million down to less than 150 parts per million. So stepwise, we're making our way towards that 75 parts per million limit that will be there. So as the REACH transition is coming, that limit value will change again in the future towards that published limit, and we'll continue to utilize the testing data that we have each year to kind of understand and help educate around how we're doing and places where we see potential for issues as we all work towards that transition together. The next substance, benzene. So benzene was included in Annex 6 in the past with a 1 part per million limit value. And in Annex 6, that limit value is just going to be slightly changed in the nomenclature there. So it's going to be clearly called out as less than 1 parts per million. And so that's a labeling change that we'll see highlighted a couple times in the slides today. And it's really just to make sure that it's abundantly clear that the value should be less than that number. And we'll talk about that again at the end as well. We have a separate slide on that. But now, because of the legal limit value changes within the CMR regulation, we have a limit of less than 5 parts per million being applied to all product classes within Annex 4. We don't see at this point any effect on the requirements of STEP or detox to zero, but when the ECO-Passport standard update is published in the near future, we should expect some effect in the limit values there. So here we have some changes related to the amine salts and related to colorants. So here with the inclusion of these colorants and specifically calling out these amine salts, we have some substances which were not strictly restricted by name in the past, but really by indirect analysis, they've been monitored and they've really been covered by OEKO-TEX and the standard 100 in particular for many years. So for 2019, what we're doing is we're adding the names of these substances into Annex 5 and Annex 7. So those are the specific tables in the back of the standard where the individual CAS numbers and substances within those groups are called out. So they're obviously now covered by the requirements. Testing, as mentioned, has already been covering these under the testing for the azo colorants, and it continues to be analyzed with a limit value of 20 parts per million. So under the new legal limits with the CMR regulation, the limit value is 30 parts per million, so the standard 100 is already covering these new legal requirements. Also, as the new substances, or as noted here, the new substances are also added to the MRSL of STEP and detox to zero as well. And so, again, like in the other cases where we have some past testing statistics, we really see a negligible impact to the certification process based on these changes. So again, some administrative changes, but maybe not going to affect people too directly. So quinoline, we have an example of one of the substances where last year OEKO-TEX added it as an under observation substance. And so what that meant is the substance was tested and reported to companies so that we had a little bit of advanced information, and we had some extra time to prepare as pending legislation might be coming. So we've seen that was pretty good decision last year. We have the legislation in place now, so hopefully people that this was affected, they've noted that those results came in on their test results for their certifications last year. In the legislation, there also is a suitable test method, and you'll see that the test method from OEKO-TEX that was developed and has been used fits nicely with that suggestion as well. So the legal limit value that's now in effect is 50 parts per million. So of course, then the under observation status is going to be lifted for 2019, and the same limit value that comes from legislation is going to be applied. So we have a limit value of less than 50 parts per million that's going to be put into place both for Annexes 4 and 6, as well as the leather standard. The substance is also reviewed in the MRSL of STEP and detox to zero. And again, we expect that when the latest version of the ECO-Passport standard is published, that there will be a defined limit value there as well in support both of the MRSL limits of STEP and the RSL limits of the standard 100. And what we want to do, what we have here, I guess, basically is some results, some sample results that we've collected under that under observation period. So again, as we put it in there and it had no impact on the certifications, it did give us the opportunity to see where we were particularly seeing failures or issues. And you can see in this case that there's clearly a difference between the textile products that we tested here and some of the dye stuff. So in these cases, you might expect that the dye stuffs that have these failures, pretty high values above the 50 parts per million limit value, could be higher or lower quality dye stuffs. And so there we have significant risk of failure that would be affected on the eco-passport side of things. But you do see it translating into some of the textile substances where you have limits either nearly approaching that 50 parts per million limit or just over, with those two results of 62 and 65 there. So as it's now a requirement, it's worth going back and double checking your test results that came from your certifications last year, and also discussing it with your suppliers just to make sure that they're aware. And we won't mention it in every one of these slides, but I would say just in general, that's a good piece of advice, is just to make sure that you're going back and not only absorbing these changes to the standard 100 and to the other products, but also sharing that with your supply chain partners who might not be doing it on their own, making sure that they're aware that you're trying to produce a product to meet the requirements, and so you need their help as well. Okay, so after all those words, what's the main takeaway? Really, in the beginning with the certifications this year from April 1st, the standard 100, really according to Annex 4, will be totally aligned with the new CMR legislation. So once you get this, then your new renewals or new certifications from April 1st on, you should be in a good position there. And even though, as mentioned, that the CMR regulation is not applicable to leather articles, we also have alignment to the regulation with those limit values of the leather standard as well. So a little bit of additional protection there for you guys. Excuse me. All right, so that's not the end of it. There are some additional changes outside of the world of the CMR regulation. So we want to highlight those as well. So these are cases where OEKO-TEX has had the opportunity to take some additional decisions on their own based on feedback, knowledge changes in the industry, whatnot. So our class here, that's a newly defined substance under the SVHC requirements, siloxanes. So we have three new substances which are textile relevant under this category, and shorthand really referenced as D4, D5, and D6. They've not been previously included in any OEKO-TEX standard, so this is not something that was included as an under observation substance last year, really because they were just added to the SVHC list here in June. So what we have, what we have here really is that these mentioned substances can be textile and leather relevant, particularly in the case of materials that are finished with silicone coatings or silicone printing, even the silicone repellency finishes that might be prevalent. And then here you also see the note around the use of one particular substance in the dry cleaning industry, which may not be particularly relevant to your production case, but it is something to keep aware of here. So I mentioned that we did not have this under observation, but in this case where we did have a few months here to gather some testing data once the method itself was done. So again, we have some information to share, kind of in some examples that we pulled where the risk might be. We do see quite a few occurrences of detectable amounts. Certainly the top two there exceeding this limit value of 1,000 parts per million, and then a few samples that are approaching those limit values as well. So again, if you're utilizing any of those techniques, or you know that there's silicone being used in products, it's definitely worth a conversation with your suppliers, supply partners, to make sure that they're aware of the requirement under standard 100 now, and get their help in terms of meeting the limit values that are in place. We also have glyphosate, which is being added here. So this is a key pesticide ingredient, and so it's being added there under the pesticide restrictions, but it is being added as under observation only. So that means in cases where pesticides are a risk and would be tested, so namely in cotton, glyphosate will be tested and reported, but it will not have an impact on the certification status for 2019. So again, it's going to be for information only, provide a little bit of insight to folks where this is potentially in the materials and within the supply chain, because we know that the substance itself is a pretty hot political topic. So although the final outcome is not yet determined for the case of restriction in the future, or what the limit value might be, anytime something is under observation, it's a little bit of a signal that we think there's potential that either legislation or restriction within OEKO-TEX could be coming in the future as early as the next year, like we've seen in some of these other cases that were under observation last year and now have been added to the testing requirements. We don't see relevance for the other standards from OEKO-TEX, so we're not going to have changes, at least at this point, within those standards as well. Nitrosamines, again, another case that has not been in either the standard 100 or other OEKO-TEX standards up until this point. They're included now because they're substances that can be found in rubber, elastics, latex, other elastic tapes, things like that. And so again, another group of substances that are being added under observation. So again, with the same signal that this is something that could mean restriction in the future. So something to be looking at right now. This group of substances are already restricted in some other industry lists and then within toy directives as well. So the positive news out of this is that if you have a need to utilize your standard 100 certificate to show compliance to another industry list or another customer list, even under that observation status where it's not going to affect whether or not the product is certified, the testing results will be there and the testing data will be there as well. So hopefully you have an opportunity there to use that testing report as proof of compliance and really to demonstrate that you're already in alignment there and potentially reduce some duplicate testing. So we also, like the last case, we don't recognize it really as a relevant topic for the other OEKO-TEX standards, and so it's only affecting standard 100 at this point. And then the testing method that's going to be utilized is basically the same as the EN 71 Part 12, so coming out of the toy directive as well. AZODICARBOXAMIDE, substance that's also a totally new inclusion for OEKO-TEX, never included even under observation in the past. Again, a substance that's relevant for certain plastics and foams, particularly as a blowing agent for expanding foam. So the substance is listed under the group of other chemical residues, so that's where you'll find it if you're looking for it in the list, and will carry a limit value of 0.1%. So again, that 1,000 parts per million, typical of substances listed as an SVHC. And then likewise, this substance will be prohibited within the MRSL step, and again is a candidate to look for restrictions when the Eco Passport standard update comes out. Some additional information, it's not going to be incorporated into Detox to Zero or to the leather standard, but of course, synthetic leathers could be potentially affected due to foams, and so those would be covered by standard 100 though. In the early pre-testing, really when the decision was to include it, we saw many of the foams that we tested contain levels higher than that 0.1%. Not only EVA foams, but also saw it within PVC and polyurethane foams as well. So again, something, if you're not familiar with it, if it's not something you have testing data on in the past, something to be looking at, potentially spot checking, or at least looking, discussing with your supply chain partners. Dimethylphthalate, so DMP is being added to the group of phthalates. So again, phthalates as a group have always been restricted. This list continues to grow as alternatives and substitutes are introduced. And this, again, is going to lead to further alignment with some of the other existing industry RSLs, where the standard 100 certification and the test results tend to be used as proof of compliance rather than requiring duplicative testing. So the addition of DMP here does not affect the limit value of any of the listed standards. So here, it's affecting all from Annex 4 through Annex 6, leather, EcoPassport, STEP, everything is affected here with the phthalates. It's not going to, the inclusion of it is not going to change the limit values here, other than where we have this minor change with the less than sign to make it a little bit clearer. But the inclusion of DMP with the whole group of phthalates keeps the limit values where they are. So for Annex 4 of Standard 100, that limit value is still sitting at 1,000 parts per million, so the 0.1%. So that it's a sum value, so this substance would then just be analyzed with the other substances already tested. Barium and selenium, so we have two new metals that are being added to the list of extractable limit values. So again, these are extractable limits, and that's applicable both to Standard 100 and the leather standard, as well as EcoPassport with the new publication. So previously within EcoPassport, these two substances were listed, but they were only relevant for colorants. Now in EcoPassport, it's planned to incorporate the limit values for these two across all product types. Within Standard 100, the extractable limit value for barium will be less than 1,000 parts per million for all product classes. And for selenium, it will be extractable limit value again, but this time less than 100 parts per million for all product classes. So we have more and more Standard 100 certificates being used for textile base or plush toys, and so having the Standard 100 limit values align with the EN71 Part 3 limits is a good thing, and also having further opportunity to align with some of these other industry lists, like a firm mentioned here, also is an opportunity to hopefully make everyone's life a little bit easier. We have no change to the STEP or Detox to Zero MRSL. Okay, so MCCP, in the past, OEKO-TEX had previously restricted short-chain chlorinated paraffins, so the SCCPs. Now the medium chain links, which is the MCCP, carbon length 14 to 17, are added. And as a result of that, we're changing the category name to generally be called chlorinated paraffins. The limit value in Standard 100 is going to be a sum limit value of both the SCCP and the MCCP. And the limit value is going to be less than 50 parts per million for all product classes across both Annex 4 and Annex 6. So that's for Standard 100. Up until now, or in the past, so last year's limits, there was a stricter limit for Annex 6, but that's changing with 2019 edition here. So now we have the same limit value of 50 parts per million across all four Annex 4 and Annex 6. In the leather standard, we have a little bit of a different case where the grouping is also changing because of SCCP and the MCCP being both included, but the limit value situation is a little bit different here. So the SCCP limit is going to be reduced to a sum limit value 50 from 100 parts per million last year. And the case with the MCCPs, though, is a little bit different here under leather, where it will be tested and reported, but is going to be under an observation status. So again, meaning that there's no failure impact, but in 2019, this is sort of a signal that we could change in the future, and so the results should lead to investigation for improvements where we know that there's a replacement for the industry. So we know that these MCCPs have been used. The leather industry is actively working to find replacements, and so again, one of the drivers for having an under observation status to help people to identify where it is in their products and where they need to be actively searching for an alternative, but having a transition time in there as well. So to further support the limit alignment to the changes in Standard 100 and to the leather standard, and the fact that the MCCPs actually were already included in STEP, we do expect inclusion within ECO-Passport when that standard is published here in the next few months, or few weeks, I should say. Aniline, again, a substance which was a popular topic last year with the changes. It's been on the Standard 100 already with a limit value of 100 parts per million. In 2019, the limit value is going to become even stricter, so it moves from 100 parts per million down to less than 20 parts per million for free or cleavable aniline in product class 1, which is aligned with the other azoamines. In product classes 2, 3, and 4, there is a slightly higher limit value of less than 50 parts per million to give a little bit more of a transition time if necessary. And then in Annex 6, if you're having your certification done according to Annex 6 in Standard 100, the limit value of 20 parts per million applies across all product classes. Significant changes from 100 down to 20 in some cases, but the good news is that across the thousands of analyses that we did last year, we've seen very few issues even above these new, even if we compared it to the new 2019 limit values. So even though it's a popular topic, apparently, at least within the Standard 100 certificate holders, it's not a huge issue for a majority of those, and so we expect the impact to the certification to be pretty small. For the leather standard, there's no real change, only a typing change here as we're adding that less than sign again. So the limit value is actually staying right about the same at less than 100 parts per million. And also in the leather standard, the limit value is only the free form of aniline, so it's not the cleavable portion. We know that the aniline-based dyestuffs are recognized as a recognized need for the leather industry, relying on that type of azocolorant. And so it's something that the leather institutes within OEKO-TEX are working on. Also ETAD's involved with looking at that and looking for options and trying to find alternatives. It also means, though, that within ECO-Passport, where those limit values are existing to support the Standard 100, there will likely be an exception rule related to some of these other products as well. So be on the lookout for that when ECO-Passport is published. So I want to speed up just a little bit. We know there's a lot of topics to cover and a lot of numbers and details to go through. But with the solvent residues, we're aligning the Annex 4 requirements in 2019 with what were the current Annex 6 requirements. So we have a limit value here of 0.05% or less than 0.05%. There is still an exception in place where those listed solvents need to be used for technical reason or there are lack of alternatives. And then as we see on the next slide, the limit values for ECO-Passport and leather standard are also tightening in alignment with the standard 100 limit values here as well. So again, this limit value for these solvent residues moving to 0.05%. No changes to step or to either to detox to 0. Flame retardant. So some highlights here. First, though, I want to start with the general OEKO-TEX rule around flame retardants is not changing. So any formulation that is a flame retardant must be approved through the active chemical products approval process directly with the OEKO-TEX Secretariat. And so that includes a separate application providing tox data, and then review by the OEKO-TEX Secretariat. Once that review is completed, then those individual flame retardant formulations have to be approved and listed in the approved products list on the OEKO-TEX website before they can be used in any of the other OEKO-TEX certifications. So before a flame retardant can be used in a standard 100 certification, it must be approved through the active chemical products approval process. So for those specifically listed substances where testing is performed once it's approved and it's used in a textile or leather, the limit values are changing here for these specifically listed flame retardants in the back of the standard. So that limit value is changing. Individual limit value is changing to 10 parts per million, both in Annex 4 and Annex 6. And then also the requirements for the chlorinated paraffins, SCCPs and MCCPs that we talked about just a few slides ago is also relevant here. And then what we're also introducing in 2019 is a sum limit value of 50 parts per million that applies for substance that could be used as flame retardants. So with all of those changes and all that being said, it's most likely only consequential in the case of contamination because of the general rule around flame retardant products being approved in advance, and the fact that intentional use of a flame retardant would likely require a much higher concentration than these limit values that we're changing from, even changing from 100 parts per million down to 10 parts per million. Again, we feel like that's affecting more likely contamination than direct intentional use. For leather, we have a similar change with some minor differences, again, because of the distinction between the SCCPs with limit values and the MCCPs as under observation. So that's, again, carrying over those changes that we talked about in their own individual category. Here, the limit value of SCCP only applies, and then again, the sum value of all flame retardants is introduced for the leather standard as well. And then additional information here on some of the legal requirements of why we're introducing that individual substance limit value of 10, and then the addition of a new substance, a new flame retardant substance that's classified as an SVHC. So that's also incorporated into the list of substances. So as you'd probably expect, these FR changes are also going to affect ECO Passport when that update is released in the future. And then one more individual flame retardant. So TCEP, the limit value is similar to the others, changing from here in this case 1,000 parts per million down to 10 parts per million. So we're in practice taking the limit value of Annex 6 from last year and applying it to all product classes in both Annex 4 and Annex 6, as well as the leather standard. So here we have consistent limit value for TCEP across standard 100 and leather, which is aligned with the other FR chemicals. Again, we don't see a major impact to the textile certifications because it's rarely found or used in textiles. Could be potentially used in foams and other plastics as well, though. Okay, so we want to talk a little bit of some additional changes that are happening with regard to Annex 6. So again, Annex 6 is the optional that you can opt into. So the OEKO-TEX philosophy with Annex 6, when it was introduced a couple of years ago, has really been to help companies to identify very small concentrations of substances and to try to drive continuous improvement in environmental performance through production and further support of the MRSL work that's being done at the facility level and expected through STEP certification as well. So as a reminder, the Annex 4 is really the default certification class for Standard 100, and companies wishing to certify according to Annex 6 limits need to opt into that during their application or the renewal process. So if there are questions in the application that you should be familiar with or be on the lookout for if you want to start certifying products to Annex 6. If there's questions about that, there's some information on the website, or of course you can always reach out to your individual institute that's helping you. In 2019, we see two particular classes where we have further reductions to the already lower limits of Annex 6. So those two that we want to highlight are PFCs. So I think people are probably pretty familiar with this for their association with water and oil repellent technologies, and then also phthalates as softeners in plastics. So for the listed PFCs, the limit values are essentially reduced 50% from where they were in 2018. So for the 2019 version of the standard, that means that we have limit values going in as listed here of 0.025 for the acids, 0.25 for some of the alcohols, and those details are listed there for you. For the phthalates, the sum limit remains the same, essentially 250 parts per million, but the limit values for each of these individual phthalates is reduced to 100 parts per million. So what that means is, for example, you could no longer have DHP, for example, with a individual result of 200 parts per million, because even though it's under that sum limit value, it exceeds the limit value for the single phthalate. So again, just trying to narrow those any gaps that might have existed in the past. We also, as the case is, we mentioned some of these before, there are some exception rules where limits are generally necessary, but there are certain places where they can't be applied. So we had an exception rule in 2018 for Annex 6 related to VOCs and glycols for certain product parts and certain applications, particularly for these buttons that are lacquered or painted or coated. So the exception rule that was in place around these VOCs and glycols was due to expire basically March 31st, so when the new changes went into effect. Hopeful that suitable alternatives would be available, but that's not the case. So what we're doing is extending that exception rule again. So now that same exception rule is extended till March 31st, 2020. And then another existing exception rule, this time around, the solvent residues, and applicable both to Annexes 4 and 6. So the rule was in place for solvent residues that exceeded 3% in the case where further processing would take place. And so in the past, this exception rule specified that the processing had to be done in a hot state. And so this is no longer the case here. So this exception is being clarified really to mean that other processes, as long as they are successful at reducing that limit, are still applicable. And so that you see the difference there as well between Annex 4 and Annex 6. So in Annex 6, that exception rule has to apply in the case of products that are exceeding 1.5%, whereas in Annex 4, we can have a result of 3%. So what this means is that hot that hot temperature or that hot requirement is not necessary. So, for example, storage at room temperature would be acceptable to reduce that limit value to, or that value to an acceptable level. And then we have a few miscellaneous changes as well that we want to highlight, make sure we catch. So as mentioned on several occasions already through the presentation, we included a less than sign in places where the limit values were not changing, but we just wanted to make absolutely clear that to meet the requirements, the value needed to be less than that number. So, you know, just a few test results that would be questionable in there, but now it's absolutely clear. And then there are also a couple of new exceptions included in the footnotes. So make sure when you're looking through both annexes 4 and 6 on each of those parameters, you'll see listings of footnotes, and make sure you're paying attention to those as well. So there are a few exceptions, particularly for pH, color fastness, and odor in the case that the products will have further wet treatment. So you have some expansion of the permitted values in those cases. And there's also a new document that's been introduced in 2019. So within ECO-Passport in the past, there was a standard terms of use document. And now what we've done is that this document has been expanded to all the products. And so the terms of use document applies to all products and really defines the legal relationship between OEKO-TEX and the customer, the company that's filling out the application. And so that document must be acknowledged in the application process. So you'll find a question checkbox in there in the application where you have to acknowledge that. That full document is available on the OEKO-TEX website, or you can of course get it from your local institute that you're working with if you want a copy of it. And I've teased a little bit as we've gone through here that the new ECO-Passport standard is not yet published and available. This is coming soon, and it is still planned to go into effect with new certifications and renewals starting April 1st. And so there are some distinct differences to textile chemicals and those needed for leather processing. So in addition to the new version coming, there also is a ECO-Passport version specifically for leather chemicals that's planned and coming in the future. So be aware of that in the future, and hopefully that helps with some of these changes that have been incorporated into the leather standard as well. And then just a few highlights, not to take up too much time, but just to talk about STEP as the facility level certification offered by OEKO-TEX here. So there are some changes to both the STEP standard and the assessment. The new standard documents are available now on the OEKO-TEX website. And those changes that are happening and really highlighted here, both in the standard itself, so what the requirements and the rules are, but also in the assessment questions, which is what the facility would fill out as they're working through to try and get certification. Both of those are automatically going to be taken into effect now with new certifications that are starting, and then companies that have certifications already in place, those will be implemented really as appropriate by the Institute as they go through sort of updating assessments, or at least through their renewal process and through the ongoing compliance auditing process. So if you are also certified to STEP, it's worthwhile to take a look at those documents and make sure that any of the changes that have been implemented, that you're well aware of those and that you can consider those for your renewal process as well. Another change is that the STEP standard, which has really been focused on textile processing, is being extended to be applicable to leather processing applications as well. So with a creative solution, the acronym STEP is not changing, but the official name is changing from Sustainable Textile Production Standard to Sustainable Textile and Leather Production Standard. So leather production facilities wanting STEP would specify leather operations in the initial application process, where you identify what are the product's processes and some other details around your facility. You specify that at the very beginning, and then during the assessment process, that designation as leather processing operations triggers the leather specific questions within that assessment portal. So those questions in that smart portal really are tailored to your specific operation. So now it's possible for leather processing facilities to work through that process as well. All right, so with that, we're really closing the highlights that we wanted to share, closing the presentation today. We are doing the presentations, or they've done it this morning already in German, this one in English. We'll do it for the colleagues in Chinese later tomorrow. And so I know that there are submitted questions coming in from all of those presentations, and so the OEKO-TEX colleagues will be gathering those together, and we'll be distributing them out with answers to there. But I'll turn it back over to Christina and see if there are any questions that came in that we should answer directly right now.
Yes, thank you so much, Ben, for this presentation. And we've received a couple of questions. I'm not sure we will be able to answer all of them today, but as you said, the questions that we can't answer, we will answer in an email later. So the first question that we have is, what is quinoline used for, and what's the reason for finding it in dispersed dyes?
So it is going to be similar to the other dye stuff. So that's the reason for finding it there. It's part of those building blocks of those particular dye stuffs. And so those are the types of products. So any product that would be dyed with dispersed dye stuffs as well would continue to be analyzed for those colorants, those restricted colorants, and quinoline would be added into that group as well.
Okay, the second question we have is regarding new textile Annex 17 restriction. Chloro-organic carriers and carcinogenic dyes were already in standard 100 and so commonly tested. What's the detection statistics for those requirements?
Yeah, so that I don't have those in front of me. Like you mentioned, they are tested, so that may be something that we can pull up from the different institutes. And so that's when I'm going to just defer a little bit and see if we can regroup with the colleagues, and if that's something that we can provide in a similar way. Because I assume that the question is to highlight, okay, what's the risk to as this being a legal requirement added.
Okay, and one last question. Isn't it a contradiction for OEKO-TEX fabric and Eco Passport product to have the same limit value for siloxane?
Yeah, I mean, that's one where I'm not as familiar with what is happening or what's going to happen exactly with the siloxane. So again, I think that's one that maybe we table and follow up on to figure out what's the reasoning coming from the technical committees on why those limit values were put where they are. So I think it's going to be better for somebody else to be able to answer that rather than me off the cuff.
Okay, great. I guess that's it for today. I'd like to thank each of you for listening in. As I mentioned before, we will send a link to the recording in case you'd like to share the information with your colleagues, or if you would like to listen to it again. And yeah, please don't hesitate to contact us if you have any more questions. And we're looking forward to hearing you at our next webinar. So from my side, goodbye and have a good day.